There are famous people, and then there are people so mythologized that even their suffering gets mistaken for performance. Michael Jackson lived in that second category. Because by the end of his life, millions believed they understood the transformation they had witnessed. They thought they had solved him. They thought the changing skin, the masks, the distance, the isolation, the strange silence around his body all pointed to one simple explanation. But what if the most famous visual change in modern celebrity culture was never understood at all? What if the world looked directly at a medical mystery and chose a rumor instead? And what if the answer was not hidden in makeup rooms, gossip columns, or tabloid covers, but in something far older, quieter, and far more intimate than image? Something written into the body long before the cameras arrived. Because the title sounds almost impossible at first, hidden in Michael Jackson's DNA. It carries the feeling of some sealed vault finally opened, some final confession waiting inside a strand of biology. And yet the truth is even more unsettling than a conspiracy. There was never a single sensational moment where the world was handed a complete map of Michael Jackson's genome and told, here is the secret. What happened instead was slower, more scientific, and far more tragic. Over the years, medical evidence, genetic research, and a deeper understanding of autoimmune disease began to reveal that the public may have spent decades mocking, doubting, and psychoanalyzing what was, at its core, a biological reality. The hidden truth was not a theatrical trick. It was vulnerability. That is what makes this story so haunting. For years, the public debate around Michael Jackson's appearance was framed like a moral puzzle. People asked what he wanted to become. They asked what he was trying to erase. They asked whether the most famous black entertainer in the world had tried to transform himself into something else entirely. The conversation rarely started from compassion. It rarely started from medicine. It started from spectacle. And once a spectacle takes hold, facts no longer arrive as facts. They arrive as interruptions. By the time Michael addressed his changing skin publicly in the early 1990s, much of the world had already decided the verdict. The image was too powerful, too visible, too easy to turn into a symbol. A changing complexion became a story about identity. A medical condition became a cultural accusation. His body became a canvas onto which millions projected fear, racial tension, resentment, fascination, and disbelief. He was not treated like a patient explaining a disorder. He was treated like a suspect explaining evidence. And that is where the mystery begins, because when a person becomes larger than life, the ordinary truths of illness stop sounding believable. If an unknown man had said that his skin was losing pigment in irregular waves, that doctors were trying to manage an unpredictable condition, that cosmetic measures were being used to create a more even appearance, few would have called it unbelievable. But Michael Jackson was not granted the dignity of being ordinary. His fame turned every explanation into a headline, and every headline into a joke. The world knew the silhouette, the glove, the voice, the moonwalk, the impossible fame that began in childhood and expanded until it swallowed everything around him. Reared in Gary, Indiana, then pushed through relentless rehearsals by a strict father, Michael emerged first as the most luminous star in the Jackson 5, and then, after Off the Wall and Thriller, as something even bigger, a global symbol recognized almost everywhere on Earth. That level of visibility did not just make him admired, it made him examinable. The more famous he became, the less his body belonged to him. Every feature became public property. Every alteration became a referendum on his soul. Source. At first, many people believed the change they were seeing was purely deliberate. They thought he had chosen whiteness as image, chosen reinvention as escape, chosen distance from his own reflection. Those assumptions hardened because they fit a dramatic narrative the culture found irresistible. In that version of events, Michael Jackson was not a man living through a disease. He was a symbol of dislocation, insecurity, and self-rejection. The story was neat, emotionally satisfying, and devastatingly incomplete. But neat stories are often the most dangerous ones. They leave no room for biology. They leave no room for pain that does not look heroic. They leave no room for disease that arrives without permission and then forces a person to negotiate with mirrors for the rest of his life. The public was not wrong to notice that Michael changed. The public was wrong in believing the change explained itself. Because behind the speculation was a condition the average viewer barely understood. Vitiligo was not a household word. It did not carry the immediate clarity of a broken bone or a visible wound. It was more elusive than that. It could spread slowly. It could appear in patches. It could create contrast so striking on darker skin that the person carrying it might feel as if their body had become a map of unwanted attention. Scientists now describe vitiligo as an autoimmune disorder in which the immune system attacks melanocytes, the cells that produce pigment in the skin. They also describe it as genetic, multifactorial, and deeply tied to immune regulation, with over 30 genes associated with increased risk and larger genetic studies identifying roughly 50 susceptibility loci. In plain language, that means the body can be born with a hidden vulnerability long before symptoms ever appear. Source. That word, vulnerability, is the key to everything that follows, because once you replace the public's favorite word, choice, with the more accurate word, vulnerability, the entire story begins to shift. Suddenly, the transformation is no longer just about how Michael Jackson wanted to be seen. It becomes about what his body was doing to him, what stress may have intensified, what treatments may have been attempted, and what kind of emotional cost attaches itself to a person whose appearance is changing while the entire world watches in disbelief. And yet almost nobody wanted that version of the story. It was too human. It was too sad. It demanded empathy in a culture that preferred intrigue. It asked people to imagine what it might feel like for your face, the face known across continents, to become unstable, medically fragile, visually unpredictable, and permanently debated. Most of all, it challenged the audience to admit that the joke they had repeated for years might have been aimed at a man fighting a real disorder. What happened next made the situation even more complicated. The more Michael tried to control how he appeared in public, the more the public interpreted control as confession. Concealment looked like proof. Makeup looked like deception. Privacy looked like theatricality. If he hid, people asked what he was hiding. If he explained, people asked why they should believe him. If doctors were mentioned, the public heard excuses. This is one of the cruelest patterns in celebrity history. Once a person is converted into myth, any attempt they make to sound ordinary becomes suspicious. And that is why the DNA question matters so much. Not because it gives us a sensational laboratory twist, but because it strips away the fantasy that all of this was merely cosmetic theater. The science does not tell us that Michael Jackson was simple. He was not. It does not erase the contradictions of his life, the surgeries, the secrecy, the unbearable complexity of his public image. But it does reveal that beneath the myths was a body carrying a medically recognized, genetically linked susceptibility that the world repeatedly reduced to a punchline. The deeper researchers understood vitiligo, the more the old jokes began to sound less like commentary and more like evidence of collective failure. Yet that was only part of the story, because if biology explains what may have been hidden in Michael Jackson's DNA, it still does not explain why the world was so eager to deny it. To understand that, we have to step into the years when the assumptions hardened, when his body became an argument, and when one of the most famous men alive stood in front of millions and tried to tell the truth, only to discover that truth, once delayed, can become almost impossible to sell. Part 2. Long before science had the language to reach the public had already found a simpler language for Michael Jackson: spectacle. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, he was no longer just the artist who had changed music videos, redefined pop performance, and become one of the most recognized entertainers in history. He had become a visual obsession. People did not simply follow his work. They monitored his face, they searched his body for clues, they compared photographs from one year to the next, as if they were studying a crime scene. Each new appearance triggered a fresh wave of speculation, and the speculation followed a pattern that soon became almost impossible to interrupt. Michael changed, therefore Michael chose. Michael looked different, therefore Michael rejected what he once was. The conclusion came first. The evidence was arranged later. It is important to understand just how powerful that assumption became. In the popular imagination, his skin did not merely lighten, it became a symbol. In a culture already tense with unresolved anxieties about race, beauty, and belonging, Michael Jackson's appearance was turned into a cultural Rorschach test. People saw self-hatred, they saw ambition, they saw artifice, they saw tragedy. What they rarely saw was illness. And once those emotional readings took hold, a medical explanation began to sound almost too mundane to be true. Then came the moment that should have changed the conversation. During his 1993 interview with Oprah Winfrey, Michael said plainly that he had a skin disorder that destroyed the pigmentation of his skin. He was emotional when he said it. He did not present it like a calculated twist. He presented it like a wound. Contemporary reporting noted that doctors considered his explanation completely plausible, and dermatologists interviewed at the time said vitiligo was the most likely condition that could cause such widespread lightening. One report explained that vitiligo destroys melanocytes, often creates blotchy and mottled skin, can run in families, and in advanced cases may lead some patients, especially when more than half the skin on the face or hands is affected, to depigment remaining areas so the overall tone appears even. Source. That should have been the end of the rumor, but it was not. Because a statement can be true and still fail to overpower a narrative people have become emotionally invested in. By the time Michael explained himself, he had already been filtered through years of tabloid mythology. The public had been trained to consume him as an enigma rather than a patient. So instead of asking what vitiligo actually does to a person, physically, socially, psychologically, many people asked whether he was lying. That skepticism reveals something uncomfortable about how celebrity works. We often say we want stars to be honest, but what we really want is for them to confirm the story we already tell about them. Michael Jackson did not fit neatly into any stable category, and when he offered an explanation rooted in disease, it collided with a public appetite for symbolism. Illness was not dramatic enough. People wanted intent, they wanted motive. They wanted the transformation to mean something about identity, not immunity. And yet the medical reality was already visible to anyone willing to see it. Vitiligo is not a neat, linear process. It can begin in small areas. It can spread unpredictably. It can be especially striking on darker skin. not because the disease is different, but because contrast is more visible. The 1993 reporting around Michael's claim even noted something else that sounds eerily prophetic in hindsight, that patients with vitiligo often become reclusive, ashamed, or intensely protective of their appearance because the condition can draw social rejection and emotional devastation. One advocate quoted at the time described how deeply isolating it could be to live in a body the world reads as damaged or strange. Source: now place that psychological burden inside the life of the most watched person on earth. A private citizen with vitiligo can retreat from a crowded room. Michael Jackson had to step into stadiums, award shows, interviews, courtrooms, and camera flashes. A regular person can cancel a photograph. Michael lived inside an archive that never stopped updating. Every uneven patch, every attempt to conceal, every cosmetic adjustment risked becoming tomorrow's worldwide headline. Even if we imagine only the surface level of that stress, it is overwhelming. But the surface level was not all there was, because hidden beneath all of this was something else entirely. The fact that the public misunderstanding was reinforced by how successfully Michael concealed the disease. Later, dermatology writing looking at public awareness of vitiligo observed that his condition had long been hidden by various methods, including makeup and tattooing, and that because the public never really saw his vitiligo patches clearly, his case became less educational than it could have been despite his fame. Ironically, the more effort he made to manage the visible consequences of the condition, the less believable the condition seemed to those watching from a distance. Source: that paradox is one of the cruelest elements of the entire story. If he had revealed more, he would have been scrutinized more brutally. Because he concealed more, he was doubted more intensely. There was no winning version of this. The body was changing, but the world demanded a performance of transparency that almost no human being could survive. And when he refused to surrender every medical detail to public inspection, people treated privacy like evidence of guilt. What happened next deepened the tragedy even further. After Michael's death, public interest in vitiligo spiked dramatically. Dermatology researchers analyzing search data found that worldwide searches for vitiligo reached their highest peak in the period immediately following his death. In other words, millions of people became more curious about the condition once he was gone than when he was alive and trying to explain it. Only then, when the spectacle had ended and the body could no longer answer back, did curiosity begin to overtake mockery. The world learned too late what it might have understood earlier if it had listened. But this story is not only about what the public got wrong, it is also about why Michael's body became such a powerful site of interpretation in the first place. His fame had begun so early, under such intense pressure, that control over his own image may have become one of the only forms of control he possessed. Childhood reports described a strict father, relentless rehearsals, and physical discipline. Later fame multiplied that pressure beyond anything ordinary psychology was designed to endure. The same person who gave the world impossible grace on stage may have spent much of his life experiencing his own body as something watched, judged, and demanded from. Source: once you understand that, even the details people mocked begin to feel different. The glove no longer looks only like branding. The masks no longer look only like eccentricity. The seclusion no longer looks only theatrical. They begin to resemble strategies, sometimes practical, sometimes psychological, sometimes both, for surviving public life inside a body that was becoming medically unpredictable. No single theory explains every choice Michael Jackson made, but the old theory, the one that reduced everything to vanity and denial, explains the least. And that is where the real story begins, because if the world believed Michael Jackson's changing appearance revealed a wish to become someone else, science was quietly moving toward a different conclusion. The body was not expressing fantasy. It may have been expressing genetics, immune misfire, inflammation, stress, and a disease process modern medicine now understands far better than the public did in 1993. The deeper researchers looked into vitiligo, the more startling the picture became. This was not a cosmetic footnote. It was a complex biological story involving the immune system, cell death, pigment cells, and inherited risk, which raises the question no tabloid could answer. If this vulnerability really was hidden in his biology all along, what exactly was his body trying to tell us? Part 3. To understand what may have been hidden in Michael Jackson's DNA, we have to begin with an uncomfortable truth about the human body. Sometimes it becomes its own enemy in silence, not with a dramatic collapse, not with a sudden cinematic diagnosis, but through small betrayals that start at the cellular level and then slowly rewrite a life. That is the simplest way to understand vitiligo. The disease does not ask who you are before it arrives. It does not care whether your face is private or globally recognized. It operates through a breakdown in the body's internal tolerance. The immune system, designed to defend, begins attacking melanocytes, the pigment-producing cells in the skin. What disappears outwardly as color may begin inwardly as confusion. Modern genetic research has transformed our understanding of that confusion. Medline Plus describes vitiligo as a condition influenced by variations in more than 30 genes, while larger research reviews say genome-wide studies have identified roughly 50 genetic loci associated with risk. A large share of those genes are involved in immune regulation. Others relate to apoptosis, the process of programmed cell death, and still others influence melanocyte function itself. That means vitiligo is not usually the product of one single bad gene. It is a layered vulnerability, a convergence of inherited tendencies and external triggers. In plain language, the body can carry the blueprint for instability long before symptoms ever become visible. Source. Two of the genes commonly discussed in basic explanations of vitiligo risk are NLRP1 and PTPN22, both of which help regulate immune activity. You do not need to speak the language of molecular biology to grasp the emotional meaning of that. It means that what the world treated as a shocking aesthetic transformation may have been rooted in immune instructions that were never visible to the eye at all. Hidden in the code of the body could be a tendency toward inflammation, misdirected defense, and pigment cell destruction, not desire, not betrayal, not performance, predisposition. And science adds another crucial detail. Genes alone are often not enough. Vitiligo is considered multifactorial. Research suggests psychological stress, ultraviolet exposure, certain chemicals, and other environmental pressures may help trigger or worsen it in people who are already predisposed. The melanocytes themselves may be unusually vulnerable to stress, and the immune system may react abnormally when those cells are distressed. Think about what that means in human terms. A person can carry the loaded gun of susceptibility for years, and then life, its pressure, trauma, exposure, exhaustion, can begin pulling the trigger. Source. Now return to Michael Jackson, not as icon, but as organism. A child driven through endless rehearsals. A prodigy shaped in a household described by family members as strict and physically punishing. An adult whose fame exploded into something close to planetary surveillance. A man whose every appearance was analyzed, whose nights were not always restful, whose stress was not occasional but atmospheric. No one can reduce an entire life to a medical trigger. But when science says psychological stress may help activate or worsen vitiligo in predisposed individuals, it becomes impossible not to feel the tragedy of that possibility in Michael's case. The body that entertained the world may also have been absorbing the very pressure that made the world adore him. This is why the phrase hidden in his DNA matters, if we use it honestly. It does not mean there was some mystical secret gene of destiny waiting to turn him into a mystery. It means the conditions for suffering may have been present beneath the skin long before the skin changed. The hidden thing was not theatrical, it was biological susceptibility. And once that susceptibility met fame, the result was not only medical, it was psychological, social, and historic. Because vitiligo is not merely about color loss, it is about visibility. It changes how a person anticipates being seen. For someone with darker skin, the contrast can be especially striking, making the difference harder to ignore and easier for others to comment on. The 1993 medical reporting around Michael's public explanation noted that the disease often leaves skin mottled and blotchy, that many cases run in families, and that when pigment loss becomes extensive, especially on the face and hands, some patients choose to depigment remaining skin so the tone becomes more uniform. That treatment is irreversible. Imagine the emotional threshold required to accept such a choice. It is not the decision of someone casually playing with image. It is the decision of someone cornered by a condition that has turned consistency into a memory. Birdig Surs. And suddenly, a great deal of Michael Jackson's visual history begins to make more sense, not in a simplistic way, and not in a way that erases every other factor in his life, but in a medically coherent way. If the patches were spreading, if the contrast was severe, if cameras amplified every irregularity, if treatments were ongoing and outcomes imperfect, if sunlight sensitivity and cosmetic management became daily concerns, then public appearances would not have been ordinary errands into fame. They would have been negotiations with exposure. That is what people often miss about science when it enters a human story. They think science reduces mystery. But in stories like this, science deepens it. Once you understand the biology, Michael Jackson does not become less tragic. He becomes more tragic. Because now the transformation is not simply a strange celebrity chapter. It becomes a chronicle of a body under siege. A body in which the immune system may have been misfiring, while the world interpreted the visible results as confession. There is another layer to this that makes the story even more haunting. Medline Plus notes that 15 to 25% of people with vitiligo also have other autoimmune conditions. The condition exists inside a broader immune landscape, suggesting that in some cases the body's self-attack is not isolated. Even without turning Michael's life into a diagnostic puzzle beyond verified facts, that larger scientific context matters. It tells us vitiligo is not merely cosmetic. It belongs to the territory of systemic vulnerability. It is the kind of diagnosis that changes not only how a person looks, but how they may experience stress, treatment, fatigue, sunlight, and the constant anxiety of progression. Source. Yet almost nobody in the public square spoke about it that way at the time. The conversation remained shallow, because shallow stories travel faster. A man says he has a pigment disorder, and instead of asking what that disorder feels like, the culture asks whether it fits the meme. A person undergoes treatments to create a more even appearance, and the public translates the treatment into motive. This is how misunderstanding becomes history, not through the total absence of facts, but through their emotional rejection. And the answer had been visible all along. The body was telling the truth, even when the headlines refused to hear it. The immune system, the pigment cells, the inherited predisposition, the possible triggers, the concealment strategies, the pain of being seen and disbelieved at the same time. Piece by piece, modern science began assembling the explanation the culture had resisted. No dramatic DNA vault was opened because it did not need to be. The genetics of vitiligo, the medical plausibility of Michael's own explanation, and the later confirmation that he did indeed have vitiligo formed a picture far more grounded than the old rumors ever were. Dermatology researchers would later note that his autopsy confirmed the condition, and public interest in vitiligo surged after his death. The truth, in other words, arrived most clearly when he was no longer alive to be doubted. The source, but the science alone still does not complete the story. Biology can explain the mechanism, yet it cannot fully measure the cost of living through it, as Michael Jackson. To understand that, we have to go beyond genes and into experience. We have to ask what it means for a person shaped by childhood pressure, transformed into a global object, and chased by endless scrutiny to inhabit a body that begins changing in ways he cannot fully control. Because once that question is asked honestly, the final revelation becomes unavoidable. The hidden truth was never only in his DNA. It was in the collision between that DNA and the life he was forced to live. Part 4. There is a particular sadness that belongs only to people who become famous too early. They are seen before they are formed. They are interpreted before they understand themselves. Their faces become public property while they are still children, and by the time adulthood arrives, the distinction between the self and the image has already started to fray. Michael Jackson may have been one of the clearest examples of that phenomenon in modern history. Before he became a mystery to the world, he was a boy under pressure. Before he became a symbol, he was a son rehearsing through fear. Before the cameras studied his face for evidence, the foundations of his life had already been built on performance, correction, discipline, and the understanding that love could be tied to perfection. That context does not prove every later choice. It does something more important. It restores emotional coherence. A man raised under extreme pressure, then launched into impossible fame, was always likely to develop a complicated relationship with visibility. If the body of that same man later began changing because of a medically real, genetically linked autoimmune condition, then the emotional consequences would have been overwhelming. What the public saw as vanity may often have been defense. What looked like obsession may have been adaptation. And what was mocked as reinvention may in part have been survival. This does not mean Michael Jackson's life can be reduced to vitiligo, or that every mystery surrounding his appearance can be solved with a single diagnosis. Human beings are too complicated for that, and Michael was more complicated than most. But the major discovery here is still devastating in its clarity. The hidden truth was not that he was secretly becoming someone else. The hidden truth was that his body carried a susceptibility the public did not understand, and that this susceptibility likely played a central role in one of the most discussed visual transformations in entertainment history. In that sense, the title is both dramatic and accurate if we strip away the sensationalism and keep the substance. Scientists did not finally reveal some supernatural anomaly in Michael Jackson's DNA. They revealed something more human. They revealed how disorders like vitiligo emerge from a mix of genetic risk, immune dysfunction, and trigger-driven biology. They revealed that what he described publicly was medically plausible and consistent with how the disease behaves. They revealed that inherited vulnerability, not simple personal intent, may have been the engine beneath the visible change. And when that understanding is brought back to Michael's life, the old narrative begins to collapse. Because history may have misread him in one of the most intimate ways possible. It may have mistaken an autoimmune struggle for a cultural statement. It may have looked at a body losing pigment and decided it was watching ambition or denial when it was actually watching disease meet fame. It may have taken a man's attention